Hello and welcome everyone to the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Raphael Fizel. I am the Executive Director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Now, some of you may be attending this series for the first time, so I'm just going to say a few words about how these talks work. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last for about 30 to 45 minutes or so. And that will then leave us with another around 45 minutes for discussion. You are all very much welcome to participate in the discussion. In fact, our speakers usually very much appreciate if people, share their comments, ask questions. If you would like to participate, could you please use the raise hand function under the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom app? That will allow me to go through the different raised hands in the order in which they were raised and allow you to ask your questions or make your comments directly. If you'd prefer, you can also use the chat function instead. I know some people usually have trouble finding the raise hand function. We will be recording the presentation bit of this event. So if you want to watch some of this talk later, you can find it on our website, animalrightslaw.org. We will not, however, be recording the discussion part. So in case that would inhibit you from sharing your views or asking your questions. So no need to worry about that. Okay, I think this covers the more formal aspects of this event. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for tonight. And that's Visa Kurki, who is an Academy of Finland postdoctoral fellow at the University of Helsinki in Finland. From January 1st, 2022, Visa will be an associate professor of jurisprudence at the University of Helsinki, which is really excellent news. So congratulations on that post, Visa. Visa completed his PhD in 2017 at the law faculty in Cambridge, where he and I, in fact, co-founded the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. So you have the co-founder of the series here. We started the series in 2015. Visa's doctoral dissertation, which I'm sure many of you will know and have read, was published by OUP in 2019. His work is broadly based in legal theory, and he has a special interest in legal personhood, rights theory, and animal law theory. Visa is also currently the director of the research project Animals under a Welfarist Regime, funded by the Academy of Finland and the University of Helsinki. Today, Visa will be talking to us about the puzzle of animal dignity. Visa, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you back here in Cambridge, or albeit virtually.
Thank you, Raphael. It's really a pleasure to be back here at this this talk series, which it's true I sort of helped co-found, but I'd say you did most of the work, I have to say. but yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me. So Raphael already introduced me, so I guess I'm not sure what else I have to say about myself, though a couple of things will be on the next slide. But as said, this talk is entitled "The Puzzle of Animal Dignity." So animal dignity was a topic that I was avoiding for a long time because I felt it was such a difficult topic. But then I was invited to Antwerp to a conference on animal dignity, and I was actually supposed to give a keynote speech there. I think Eva Kempers, who is in the audience, may have been behind the invitation. And that meant that I had to figure out what I think about animal dignity. And thankfully, the conference was postponed for a year and a half because of COVID, so I had another year and a half to think about it. But now I've got some idea at least. But this is definitely work in progress. I haven't written a paper yet or anything, so I very much welcome all of your comments. So Raphael already said most of this stuff, but I should just briefly advertise our project. So the project is running right now up until 2024. It's on animal law, both sort of analysis of current animal law from different angles, but also we do a monthly seminar with all sorts of interesting presentations. We have a visiting researcher program as well. We're going to have a number of visitors next spring. And I'm also happy to report, we haven't made an official announcement yet, but we're going to have a conference on animal law. I think the title is Theory of Animal Law on June 16th to June 18th next summer. And the keynote speakers are going to be at least Gary Francioni and Saskia Stucki. We might yet have a third keynote as well. But if you're interested, well, you can write me an email, but we're definitely going to advertise it soon. So we're going to have an open call for abstracts and so on. Anyway, so if we now move on to the topic of today, so what exactly is animal dignity, or more specifically, what's meant by the notion of dignity in animal law? What I mean by animal law here is not only sort of the legal regulations and principles and so on, but also the sort of academic practice of animal law. So what do we mean when we talk about dignity, or more specifically, animal dignity in this context? That's what I'm going to try to explain during this presentation. And the basic issue, which I think many of you might be familiar with if you've done any work on dignity, is that the notion is very slippery, vague, ambiguous in various ways. Not, I mean, this applies to animal dignity, but I think it applies to dignity more generally. So even though, for instance, many human rights scholars think that dignity is in one way or another the foundation of human rights law, they often struggle at explaining what dignity is exactly. At least I think a part of the reason why dignity is such a difficult topic has to do with its genealogy. So Jeremy Waldron, for instance, I think that in a relatively famous paper has pointed out that the notion of dignity has, in a way, its roots in two different, how should I put it, maybe intellectual traditions. One is the sort of Kantian tradition of würde, what the Kantian notion of würde is in English, translated into English as dignity. And in this sort of Kantian tradition, dignity means something like absolute worth. Those who had dignity should never be treated merely as means, for instance, but always as ends in themselves. So this is like the one dignity tradition, and the other is then the sort of tradition, what Waldron, for instance, called dignitas, or the meaning of dignity that he calls dignitas, which is more about having a high social standing, going back to Roman authors and then developing through the Renaissance and so on. And one of the issues here supposedly is that both of these different notions have sort of become a kind of chimera of sorts. We sort of use the same word to refer to two relatively different concepts, perhaps, or are they still the same concept? Difficult to say. Maybe we'll figure it out during this presentation. So here are some different ways the word dignity is used. So sometimes, I'm not claiming that this would be an exhaustive list by any means, but here are like some different senses that I think are relevant. So first of all, dignity can be understood as a legal argument or as a legal norm. So for instance, human rights lawyers sometimes claim that that human dignity on one hand is somehow the in the background of all human rights, but that dignity can also be some kind of right or rule of its own. So some practices may be problematic from the point of view of human rights merely because they violate human dignity, even if you might not be able to so how should I put it, that human rights, even if no sort of human rights that's enumerated in the Bill of Rights of say the European Human Rights Convention, even if none of those rights would in themselves prohibit some practice, dignity in itself might be the reason to prohibit some practice. I think dwarf tossing is the sort of most famous example used here. The word dignity, of course, appears in various sources of law. For instance, the Finnish constitution mentions dignity, even though dignity is a bit difficult to translate into Finnish because in this context, Finnish doesn't clearly distinguish between dignity and intrinsic value. Then dignity can also be understood as an explanation or a justification of something. So it can be seen as an animating idea or ideology behind some legal norms. So again, human rights are a very good example of this. It is also again in the human rights context understood as the moral source of some rights. So human rights somehow emanate from human dignity. It can also be said that it explains some of our moral intuitions, perhaps the requirement that we respect dignity. By the way, this is my cat Shiva, whose voice you might already have heard in the background. He always gets really upset when I give a presentation. And finally, dignity can also be seen as a kind of a conclusion in the sense that you can be in a state, you can be the dignified state. So when we, for instance, talk about some humans as living like an undignified existence, or animals for that matter, where in a way saying that they have somehow lost their dignity, right? Which is problematic, and which is somehow we have deprived them of their dignity and should be given back to them. And of course, here is one of the great paradoxes of dignity talk, which is that on one hand, especially in the human context, dignity is inalienable, but on the other hand, there are expressions such as an undignified existence, suggesting that in some situations, human beings might have lost their dignity. Given that I'm interested in rights theory, so I definitely was a bit confounded by what exactly is meant when dignity is claimed to be a source of rights. And in this sort of analytic tradition that I represent, you're of course interested in, you try to explain these things in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So dignity can be seen as a necessary condition for human rights, in the sense that there wouldn't be any rights without dignity. The problem here is, well, this depends on what exactly we then mean by rights. So if we mean, say, human rights, maybe this is true potentially. But if we mean rights in general, we run into problems, for instance, with the rights of corporations. Most of you will probably agree that corporations don't have dignity, but it's relatively clear that corporations do hold some legal rights. Hope my cat is not disturbing you or too much. This very often happens when I give a talk. Then I think another issue, if we at least are not convinced that animals have dignity, then the issue is, or let's put it this way, at least current welfarist legislation in most countries does not recognize that animals would have dignity. But regardless, at least I put forward the claim that animals, regardless, already have legal rights. So there again, it would seem that dignity is not a necessary condition for rights. If we have animals whose dignity is not recognized in law, but regardless, they would seem to hold rights if we follow the interest theory of rights. I'm very weak rights, but rights nonetheless. That not, of course, like fundamental rights. Then on the other hand, if we think that dignity is a sufficient condition for rights, we run into somewhat different problems. So another way of putting these, what it means to say that dignity is a sufficient condition for rights would be that always where you find dignity, you will find rights. Well, there are a number of problems here. First of all, for instance, Switzerland seems to, I mean, in the Swiss constitution, dignity is actually given to all living beings, not only animals. In English, you sometimes also can find talk of, for instance, the dignity of offices, a dignity of flags, for instance. I Googled this, so in the Muslim tradition, in English-speaking Muslim tradition, you sometimes talk of the dignity of the Quran, for instance. But it's not obvious that, for instance, offices and holy books have rights. This is not at least obvious to me. Human biomaterial would be another example. Even though human biomaterial might have some kind of dignity, it's not clear that human biomaterial in itself would have rights. So it's a bit problematic to say that dignity would be a sufficient condition for rights. Then on the other hand, if you think about rights, especially about animal rights, in line with what I call the orthodox view of legal personhood, which is that animals currently do not hold rights, but regardless have some kind of dignity, for instance, in Switzerland, then the dignity as a sufficient condition for rights claim would again be problematic, because animals would then have dignity but no rights. So there are all sorts of, it's quite unclear what exactly this idea of dignity as a source of rights means. I think a more sort of a promising way of approaching this is that of John Tassiolas, who suggests that, at least in the human context, human dignity plus interests lead to human rights. And what's interesting is that Tassiolas, in a working paper version of one of his papers, he writes that, to my mind, there is no compelling reason to deny that non-human animals possess the capacity to have some moral rights, a capacity that can be articulated in terms of their own species-specific dignity. So Tassiolas actually suggests, he's a very prominent human rights scholar, suggests that other animals might have their own species-specific dignity. Though as far as I remember, this part was then removed from the final version of the paper. But the question then is that if dignity rights are maybe some kind of a subset of rights, perhaps, what kind of rights are they then exactly? So what exactly sort of follows from having dignity? So what I'm sort of going to try to do here is provide a sort of rather general framework about animal dignity. and this might be the same thing as the concept-conception distinction. I'm not honestly quite sure about it. It might be something different as well, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with this distinction. So concept is a very vague idea or general idea about something. So with the case of justice, a concept would be, the concept of justice would be, for instance, that justice is about treating equal cases equally. So most of us would probably agree that that's what justice is at least about. And then a conception of justice would be something more specific, such as this Kantian way of approaching justice, which is that justice is about never using anyone merely as a means. So what I'm going to try to do is provide a sort of a very general sense of animal dignity that maybe most people could agree on. But what I'm going to do it in a way that's maybe quite typical of how I approach many things, which is I'm going to make things complicated and suggest that there's a lot of different elements that don't always come together and so on. So if you're familiar with my work on legal personhood, this may seem familiar. So can we then discern a concept of animal dignity in animal law, including scholarship and legislation? So in this broad sense of animal law. Well, I would suggest, first of all, that dignity in sort of it's how it's used, for instance, in I think European animal law practice and scholarship and so on is first of all that dignity is understood as non-welfarism. So welfarism is somehow not enough, but I wouldn't say that dignity replaces welfarism, but rather it's not only welfarism, or it's in a way more than welfarism. So welfarism is still sort of included. So what I mean by welfarism here is that we protect animals' welfare in various ways. We prohibit the infliction of unnecessary suffering and so on. But the jurisdictions that employ sort of dignity-based accounts of animal protection do not contend with this, but rather add something to it. And what is it that they add then? Well, so I think the animating idea behind welfarist animal law is very broadly, can be broadly understood as the idea of humane treatment of animals, which I think usually can be fleshed out in terms of two principles: the prohibition of unnecessary suffering and the prohibition of animal cruelty. Whereas dignity-based animal law is based on the animating idea of respect, that we respect animals. But respect, of course, is still a very vague notion. So what does respect mean then? So first of all, I think at least in this very broad sense, saying that X has dignity means that X qua Y, so X as something, for instance, X as a sentient being, X as a human being or something else, is owed respect under some normative system, morality, law, or maybe something else. And in this sense, it's still a very broad notion. So we might still owe respect to offices and holy books and flags and so on. But I think C.E. Abate puts it quite well in how she approaches the respect of beings that have inherent value, which is that to respect a creature with inherent value, we ought to treat and view that creature as valuable as the kind of being it is. And this is, I think, like approaching the sort of vague concept of dignity. But I think we can say more than that, because I think in this sort of animal law context, dignity seems to revolve around four aspects. So the first is anti-instrumentalization. So the focus here is on that animals should not be treated merely as means, and the anathema here would be that they are treated merely as an animal is treated merely as a tool. Second is the idea of flourishing. I'll get back to that in a second, but the focus here was in roughly the sort of Nussbaumian idea of flourishing and capabilities and so on, and whereas the anathema here would be treatment that neglects flourishing and capabilities. The third aspect of dignity is egalitarianism. So this is related to the sort of dignitas background of dignity. And here the focus is on social hierarchy. and the anathema would be treatment that expresses disrespect toward an animal. And the fourth, and this might come as a surprise to some of you, but I think the sort of fourth aspect of dignity is what I call sanctity here. And here the focus is on the integrity of beings. And the anathema here would then be treatment that meddles with the essence of a being with dignity. And this sanctity idea, it has religious roots, as of course many moral ideas have, but you can take it in a secular sense as well, but I'll get back to that in a second. But of course, these four different aspects of dignity sort of overlap and interact in various ways. So I think you can sort of understand many situations where dignity is invoked can be understood through the lens of these various aspects quite often, not always, but often. So here's an example of how I see these different aspects of dignity working, and we'll take the Swiss Animal Welfare Act as an example because it has a relatively clearly defined, it defines quite clearly what it means by dignity, or rather disregard of dignity. So in the Swiss Animal Welfare Act, I think it's called disregard for dignity can occur if strain is caused to an animal that's not justified by overriding interest, if I remember it correctly. And the strain is deemed to be present in particular if, first, pain, suffering, or harm is inflicted on the animal. Well, this is, we'll go through the list first. Second, if it's exposed to anxiety or humiliation. Third, if there is major interference with its appearance or its abilities, or four, if it's excessively instrumentalized. So here we can see that first, the idea of that pain, suffering, or harm would be on the animal would somehow be wrong, can be explained in terms of flourishing, that we're preventing the animal from flourishing. It can also be explained in terms of welfarism. So this is sort of what the welfarist approach is definitely would prohibit as well. Then anxiety, I think, is still explainable in terms of welfarism, but the humiliation is more about the egalitarianism aspect of animal dignity. Interference with appearance or abilities, I think that's related to the sanctity part, you might also want to call it integrity if you want to. So we are interfering with sort of what the animal is in a way. We're trying to change what the animal is somehow. It's of course also related to flourishing in various ways. I think flourishing can explain some parts of why we prohibit interference with the appearance or abilities of an animal, but not all of it. And then, well, quite obviously, the prohibition of excessive instrumentalization relates to anti-instrumentalization. So let's go through these aspects in turn. So first of all, anti-instrumentalization is relatively clear. So this is related to the Kantian tradition of dignity as würde. I think I'll just briefly note that one thing I think some people get wrong in the animal law scholarship is that you can already have sort of limited types of anti-instrumentalization already under welfarism. So some kind of practices can already be prohibited under welfarism. And I think like the development toward abolitionism and sort of this completely respecting this sort of würde of animals can be gradual. I mean, of course, like Gary Francione would argue that it might theoretically be gradual, but in practice, it's not going to happen. But this is just maybe a bit off topic almost. The second, I'm assuming many of you are familiar with Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach and how she applies it to non-human animals. Nussbaum suggests that animals are agents, and as thus they seek their own flourishing, and we should then support them as these kinds of agents. This is how I think respect for agency also comes in to dignity. I think one of the difficult issues here is sort of what kind of qua what, so as what do we understand the animals? So do we want to understand in light of sort of certain species norms, or rather as individuals, and so on? This might get they might be in conflict even in some cases. Then I think egalitarianism may be a bit difficult to explain how it relates to animals. So Waldron, in his famous article, suggests that dignity should be understood as giving a high rank to everyone, and as the prohibition of the humiliation of animals, for instance. So here I think it's quite useful to think of this in terms of what Karunab Kaitan and C. Abate have written about. I think unbeknownst to each other, I think they've expressed somewhat similar ideas. So Kaitan has argued that dignity could be understood as a sort of expressive norm, meaning that our actions constantly express meanings or attitudes such as disrespect and contempt and insult and stigma and so on. And if I say sort of demeaning things about someone, even if that person would never hear about what I've said, I can, according to Kaitan at least, disregard or disrespect their dignity, regardless of whether this actually has any adverse consequences for that person. And this is how he then, I think, tries to explain, for instance, what's wrong with dwarf tossing, because this, even if the dwarves themselves would have consented to this, I mean, this was like their livelihood, basically, it would still express such disrespect toward them that it violates their dignity. In a somewhat similar or somewhat similar idea, I think, is expressed by Abate, who uses the idea of respect markings. So we mark respect in different ways. So we, for instance, name humans. So if we think of someone as a human being, we give them a name. I mean, for instance, if parents have a miscarriage, they might still want to name the child. So this would be a way they mark respect toward the baby. Similarly, we don't eat humans, and that's another way we mark respect. But in a way, these things are contingent. So you could show respect and disrespect, or mark respect and disrespect in various ways. But this is something that I think might explain some of our practices regarding dignity and how it's applied to animals. And then finally, sanctity. So the reason why I'm suggesting that sanctity might explain a certain sort of aspect of dignity has to do with the fact that dignity is often invoked to, for instance, in cases where we are trying to make sense of genetic manipulation, for instance. So some people have the intuition that it's wrong to genetically manipulate animals, and I guess human beings as well, and they often wish to invoke dignity in this context. And I think, for instance, Anne Lansing has argued that this would be wrong because it does not let animals be the kind of beings they are, But here I think the problem here has to do with the so-called non-identity problem, because we're asking, like, we should then ask, like, letting what animals be the kind of beings they are. If they are created from birth to be of a certain genetically manipulated kind, then there is no other kind that they would have been, for instance. There is only this genetically manipulated animal, and that's the kind of being it is, or he is, or she is. I did hear an interesting idea at the Antwerp conference that this could be understood in terms of the Republican idea of domination. So we are sort of dominating the lives of other animals. And that's actually, I think, a good way to go, or a good potential way to go, definitely. but anyway, assuming that doesn't work out, I think the sanctity, there's definitely something to the sanctity idea. I think sanctity here has to do with treating something with respect because of what it represents. And this, I think, is clearly seen is in the Christian tradition of human dignity, which I think Waldron, for instance, doesn't discuss that much. So if you look at, for instance, the Catholic doctrine of dignity, you encounter this idea of imago Dei. So the dignity of human body pertains not only to the fact that it's our body, but because we are made in God's image. So by sort of meddling with human genetic material, for instance, we are violating the will of God in a way. We're disrespecting God's work. And this is, I'm not saying that this sort of Christian idea would necessarily have to be invoked here, but rather just the idea that we are somehow violating, by say, genetically manipulating animals, we might be violating what the sort of material represents. We might be violating a sort of animalhood in a way, or those. If we're say manipulating the genetic material of chickens, we could then be violating chickens, the living chickens. That would maybe be the idea. But this is something that I'm trying to make sense of, that why people want to invoke dignity in these contexts. And there's definitely this sort of strand of dignity, of a tradition of dignity that I think, for instance, Waldron, and I think many other scholars as well, have not really considered. So just to make it more I don't know, visual. So here is the idea that if we tamper, say, tamper with the genetic material of chickens, we are, because they somehow represent, there is a relationship of representation here, where disrespecting the chickens by tampering with the genetic material. So in a way, this relates to what I said earlier about respect and respect markings and so on. And then if you think that the sort of broad concept of dignity can be explained in terms of these different aspects, you might then, of course, have narrower conceptions of dignity. So some people might pronounce like theory of dignity that might ignore some of these aspects, or maybe give less weight to some of these aspects and focus more on some others, for instance. And I think that's fine, of course, but I'm trying to sort of make sense of the overall discourse here. And finally, I think one important point here is that for instance, when people discuss the Swiss animal dignity notion, they often say that this dignity is somehow, it's a different kind of dignity because it's relative, whereas human dignity is absolute. But I'm not sure if you need to think of it in these terms, because it's not obvious that dignity, if we think of dignity as some kind of a state that you can be in, so you can be in a dignified or an undignified state, then that means that it's not, if we take that sense, then it's not a normative principle in itself, but rather normative principle would be something different. And in that case, we could say that the human dignity and animal dignity are not that different, at least in this regard, in the sense that human dignity would be absolute and animal dignity would be relative, but rather the normative principles, so in this case, the legal principles pertaining to them are different. So again, in the sort of Swiss case, human dignity would be accompanied by more like an absolute principle saying that the human dignity may never be violated, whereas the animal dignity would be accompanied by a principle saying that animal dignity must be taken into account or something like that. And only by combining these two would you then be able to reach a normative conclusion. So that's it. Thanks so much. And I very much look forward to your comments.